The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Diner on Route 47, creating rivulets that distorted the neon signs across the street. Inside, the warm glow of overhead lights cast long shadows across worn vinyl booths where locals nursed their coffee and tried to forget about another long day. Nobody paid much attention to the man who limped through the front door, his right leg dragging slightly as he made his way to an empty corner booth. He was unremarkable at first glance. Medium height, weathered face, dark hair streaked with premature grey. But there was something in his eyes, a distant look that spoke of places far from this quiet Pennsylvania town. As he settled into his seat, carefully positioning his injured leg, 3 young men at the counter began to take notice. What happened? Next would remind everyone present that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most vulnerable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen had been driving for 16 hours straight when he finally pulled into Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The small town appeared through his windshield like something from a postcard. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and the kind of main street where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was exactly the kind of place he'd been avoiding for the past 8 months. His right leg throbbed as he stepped out of his battered Honda Civic, a reminder of why he was here. The doctors in Baltimore had been clear. He needed rest, physical, therapy, and time away from the chaos that had defined his life for the past decade. Millbrook offered all 3, plus the anonymity of being just another face in a town small enough that people minded their own business. The apartment he'd rented was above Patterson's hardware store, a narrow space with slanted ceilings and windows that overlooked the town square. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who owned the building, had been kind enough to overlook his lack of references in exchange for 3 months' rent paid up front. She'd asked no questions about the slight limp, or the way his eyes automatically scanned every room he entered. For the first week, Marcus kept to himself. He bought groceries at dawn, when the store was nearly empty, took long walks on the outskirts of town where the sidewalks gave way to dirt roads, and spent his evenings reading by the window. The routine was therapeutic in its simplicity. Wake, eat, walk, read, sleep. No explosions in the distance, no radio chatter crackling with urgent coordinates, no split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The leg was healing, slowly but surely. The shrapnel had been removed successfully, but the muscle damage would take months to fully repair. Physical therapy helped, but progress came in small increments. Some days were better than others. On good days, the limp was barely noticeable. On bad days, like today, every step sent sharp reminders through his nervous system. It was on one of those bad days that Marcus decided to break his routine and have dinner at Murphy's Diner instead of eating another frozen meal in his apartment. The rain had started around noon and showed no signs of letting up. By evening, the streets were slick with water and fallen leaves, making his usual walk inadvisable. Murphy's Diner had been a Millbrook institution since 1962, according to the faded sign by the door. The interior hadn't changed much since then. Red, vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and a long counter with chrome stools that spun when you pushed them. The smell of coffee and fried food hung in the air, mixed with the lingering aroma of decades of cigarette smoke from the days when smoking was still allowed indoors. Marcus chose a corner booth where he could sit with his back to the wall and observe the rest of the room, old habits that would probably never fade completely. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Dolores, brought him a menu and a cup of coffee without being asked. "First time in?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes, ma'am. Just moved into town last week. Well, welcome to Millbrook. The meatloaf's good tonight and the apple pie is fresh out of the oven. Marcus ordered both, along with mashed potatoes and green beans. As Dolores walked away, he became aware of voices from the counter. 3 young men, who looked to be in their early 20s, dressed in work clothes and speaking loudly enough that their conversation carried across the diner. The tallest of the 3 was Jake Morrison, though Marcus didn't know his name yet. Jake had graduated from Millbrook High 3 years ago and had been working at his father's construction company ever since. He had the kind of swagger that came from being the local football star in high school and never quite adjusting to the reality that those days were over. His 2 companions, Tyler Brennan and Chad Hoffman, had been his teammates and still followed his lead in most things. "You see that guy over there?" Jake said, nodding toward Marcus's booth. "Look at the way he's sitting, all paranoid and stuff." Tyler glanced over his shoulder. "Which guy?" "Corner booth. The one who can barely walk straight. Probably some drunk who got in a car accident." Chad laughed a little too loudly. "Or maybe he fell down the stairs, trying to find his next fix." Their conversation continued, growing progressively louder and more crude. Marcus tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the rain against the windows and the warm comfort of his coffee. But their voices carried, and other diners were beginning to notice. "I bet he's one of those homeless vets you see panhandling in the city," Jake continued. "Probably came here thinking small-town people are easier marks." "Should we call Sheriff Martinez?" Tyler asked. "I mean, we don't know what kind of person he is." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on his coffee cup. In another life, he might have walked over and corrected their assumptions. But that life had ended 8 months ago in a hospital bed in Germany, and the man he was now preferred to avoid confrontation. Dolores returned with his dinner, setting the plates down with a concerned expression. "Don't mind them," she said, quietly. "They're good boys mostly, just young and stupid sometimes." "It's fine," Marcus replied, though his appetite had diminished considerably. But Jake Morrison wasn't finished. Perhaps emboldened by the lack of response from the corner booth, or maybe just showing off for his friends, he stood up from his stool and walked over to Marcus's table. "Excuse me," Jake said, his voice carrying that particular blend of false politeness and barely concealed hostility that Bullies had perfected since elementary school. "I couldn't help but notice you're new around here." Marcus looked up from his meatloaf. Up close, Jake was even younger than he'd appeared from across the room, probably 22 or 23, with the kind of soft features that suggested he'd never faced real hardship. His work clothes were clean, his hands uncalloused despite claims of construction work. "That's right," Marcus said evenly. "Well, this is a nice, quiet town. Family-oriented, you know? We like to keep it that way." "I'm sure you do." Jake's smile faltered slightly at the calm response. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe anger, something he could work with. Instead, he was met with steady eye contact and an unreadable expression. "The thing is," Jake continued louder now, "we've had some problems lately with transients. People passing through, causing trouble, making residents uncomfortable." Tyler and Chad had moved closer, flanking their leader like backup singers. In a particularly unpleasant performance, the diner had grown quiet, other patrons watching the scene unfold with varying degrees of discomfort and curiosity. "I'm renting an apartment above Patterson's Hardware," Marcus said. "Mrs. Patterson can vouch for me if you'd like to check." "Oh, I'm sure she can," Jake replied. "But the thing is, we can usually tell just by looking at someone whether they're going to fit in here or not, and you—" He made a show of looking Marcus up and down. "You've got that look, you know, that damaged goods look." Marcus set down his fork carefully. "Damaged goods? Yeah, the way you walk, the way you sit, the way you're always looking around like you're expecting trouble. We get guys like you sometimes. Usually, they're running from something, bad debts, angry ex-wives, maybe some legal troubles. Or maybe," Chad chimed in, "they're just looking for their next score. easy target in a small town where people trust each other. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus could feel the weight of every eye in the diner, could sense the shift in atmosphere from curiosity to tension. In his previous life, this situation would have been resolved quickly and decisively. But that man had been trained to eliminate threats, and these weren't threats. They were just small-town bullies with too much time and too little sense. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice still calm. "I'm here to recover from an injury, nothing more." "What kind of injury?" Jake pressed. "The kind you get in a bar fight, or maybe the kind you get when you try to rip off the wrong person." Marcus's hand tightened slightly around his coffee cup, the only visible sign of his growing irritation. "The kind you get serving your country." The admission surprised him. He hadn't intended to reveal anything personal, but something about Jake's smug assumption had triggered a response. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Jake's face. But it was too late to back down now, at least from Jake's perspective. His friends were watching, the whole diner was watching, and admitting he was wrong about a limping stranger would be too much of a blow to his carefully constructed image. "Oh, so now you're a war hero," Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's convenient. Funny how every broken-down guy with a sob story claims to be a veteran these days." Tyler laughed on cue. "Yeah, it's like everyone who can't hold down a job suddenly becomes a Navy SEAL or something." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous. He'd heard doubts about his service before, from politicians and protesters and people who'd never been further from home than the next county, but somehow hearing it from these three small-town bullies in a place where he'd come to heal felt different. "You don't believe me," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Let's just say I'm skeptical," Jake replied. "Real veterans don't usually creep around town like they're casing the joint. They integrate, get jobs, become productive members of society. They don't sit in diners looking like they're planning their next move." Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering this perspective. "And what would convince you?" Jake's grin widened. "Well, if you really are some kind of soldier, you should be able to prove it, right? I mean, they teach you guys all kinds of skills. In the military, self-defense, weapons training, survival stuff. They do. So prove it. Show us what a real American hero looks like." The challenge was implicit but clear. Jake wanted a demonstration, preferably one that would end with Marcus embarrassed, or, better yet, on the floor. The young man had probably been in a few scraps in high school and figured his size advantage would be enough to handle someone with an injured leg. Marcus looked around the diner. Dolores was standing behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone, clearly debating whether to call the sheriff. The other patrons were watching with the kind of morbid fascination that people showed for car accidents, horrified but unable to look away. "I don't think that's necessary," Marcus said finally. "Of course you don't," Jake shot back, "because you're not what you claim to be. You're just another con artist looking for sympathy and handouts." Marcus pushed his plate away, the meatloaf still half finished. He reached into his wallet and placed a $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover his meal and a generous tip for Dolores. "I think I'll be going," he said, starting to slide out of the booth, but Jake wasn't finished. As Marcus stood up, putting most of his weight on his good leg, Jake reached out and gave him a hard shove on the shoulder. The push wasn't particularly forceful, but it was unexpected, and Marcus's injured leg buckled slightly, causing him to grab the edge of the table for support. The diner erupted in a mixture of gasps and nervous laughter. Jake and his friends seemed to find the moment hilarious, while several other patrons looked genuinely appalled at the display. "Oops," Jake said with mock concern. "Sorry about that, war hero. Guess I don't know my own strength. Marcus straightened, slowly, his expression never changing. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, a glimpse of the man he'd been before Millbrook, before the injury, before the long months of recovery and self-imposed exile. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by the same calm neutrality he'd maintained throughout the encounter. "No harm done," Marcus said quietly. He moved toward the door, his limp more pronounced now after the stumble. Behind him, Jake was holding, caught with his friends and anyone else willing to listen. "Did you see that? Some war heroes can't even stand up to a little push. These wannabe soldiers are all the same. Big talk, no action." Marcus paused at the door, his hand on the handle. For a long moment he stood perfectly still, and those closest to him might have noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the way his breathing became controlled and measured. Then he pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. The cold air hit him like a slap, but it was welcome after the stifling atmosphere of the diner. Marcus stood under the narrow awning for a moment, letting the rain wash away the tension that had built up in his shoulders and neck. His leg throbbed, partly from the injury and partly from the awkward way he'd had to catch himself when Jake pushed him. Behind him, the diner continued its normal rhythm, though he could still hear Jake's voice carrying through the walls, no doubt regaling anyone who would listen with his version of events. Marcus considered going back inside, not to fight, but to set the record straight, to explain who he really was and what he'd done for his country. But what would be the point? Men like Jake Morrison lived in a world where their biggest challenges were high school football rivalries and construction deadlines. They couldn't comprehend the reality of war, the weight of responsibility that came with life and death decisions, or the price that some people paid for their freedom to sit in diners and mock strangers. Marcus began the slow walk back to his apartment, each step sending small shocks through his damaged leg. The rain had intensified, and by the time he reached Patterson's Hardware, his clothes were soaked through. He climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment, his hand gripping the railing tighter than usual. Inside, he peeled off his wet clothes and ran a hot shower, standing under the spray until the tension began to leave his muscles. As the water poured over him, he found himself thinking not about Jake Morrison or his friends, but about the mission that had ended his career and brought him to this small Pennsylvania town. It had been a routine operation, at least by the standards of his unit. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a compound outside Kandahar, and Marcus's team had been tasked with extraction. They'd done similar missions dozens of times. Fast insertion, secure the target, extract before enemy reinforcements could arrive. But this time had been different. The intelligence had been wrong, or incomplete, or deliberately misleading. Instead of a lightly defended compound, they'd walked into a carefully planned ambush. The enemy had been waiting for them, and they'd brought enough firepower to turn the extraction into a running battle that lasted 4 hours. Marcus had been the last man out, covering his team's retreat while enemy fire erupted around him like a deadly light show. He'd run through that hell for 3 miles, dodging bullets and improvised explosives, carrying a wounded teammate on his back for the final kilometer. The shrapnel that destroyed his leg had come from the last IED of the day, detonating just as they reached the extraction point. The doctor said it was a miracle he could walk at all. His commanding officer said it was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. The medal ceremony had been held in a hospital room in Germany, with Marcus flat on his back and too drugged to fully understand what was happening. But none of that mattered. Now, what mattered was that 3 young men in a small-town diner thought they knew him based on a limp and a careful way of sitting. What mattered was that they'd felt entitled to judge him, to threaten him, to physically assault him because they'd decided he didn't belong in their perfect little world. Marcus dried off and put on clean clothes, then sat by the window overlooking the town square. The rain was still falling, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon and streetlight. Somewhere out there, Jake Morrison was probably still holding court, telling anyone who would listen about the coward he'd run out of Murphy's diner. Let him talk, Marcus thought. Let him enjoy his moment of triumph over a limping stranger who wouldn't fight back. Because Marcus Chen had learned something important during his years of service, something that Jake Morrison and his friends would probably never understand. The most dangerous enemies were often the ones who looked the most harmless, and sometimes the people who chose not to fight were the ones you should fear the most. The next morning brought crisp October air and the kind of golden sunlight that made small towns look like movie sets. Marcus woke before dawn, as he had every day for the past 15 years, his internal clock more reliable than any alarm. The events at Murphy's diner felt distant in the early morning quiet, like something that had happened to someone else. He made coffee and sat by the window, watching Millbrook come to life. Mrs. Patterson unlocked the hardware store below at exactly 7:30, just as she had every morning since he'd moved in. The mail carrier, a cheerful woman named Betty, waved up at his window as she made her rounds. Life in small towns followed predictable patterns, and there was comfort in that predictability. But comfort was a luxury Marcus couldn't afford to get too attached to. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in places like Fallujah and Helmand Province, where letting your guard down for even a moment could mean the difference between going home and going home in a box. Around 9, he decided to venture out for groceries. His leg felt better this morning. The rain often made the damaged muscles ache, but clear weather brought relief. The walk to Henderson's Market took him past the town square, where a small crowd had gathered around the war memorial. Veterans Day was still weeks away, but someone had placed fresh flowers at the base of the granite monument. Marcus paused to read the names etched into the stone. Boys from Millbrook who'd never made it home from Vietnam, Korea, and both world wars. Their ages were heartbreaking, 19, 20, 22. Kids who'd probably never been further from home than the county seat before they found themselves in foreign countries fighting foreign wars. Touching, isn't it? Marcus turned to find Sheriff Angela Martinez approaching. She was a small woman, maybe 5'4", but she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of dealing with people at their worst. Her uniform was pressed, her badge polished, and her dark eyes missed nothing. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied. "I heard there was some trouble at Murphy's last night." News traveled fast in small towns. Marcus wasn't surprised that the sheriff had already heard about the confrontation, though he wondered which version of events she'd been told. Nothing serious, just a misunderstanding. Sheriff Martinez studied him for a moment. Jake Morrison can be overly protective of this town. He means well, but sometimes his enthusiasm gets ahead of his judgment. He's young. He is. But young or not, nobody has the right to put their hands on another person without cause. She paused. Dolores said he pushed you. Marcus shrugged. Like I said, nothing serious. Maybe not to you, the sheriff said, but it is to me. This is a good town with good people, and I won't have visitors thinking we're all bullies and troublemakers. I don't think that. I'm glad to hear it. But I want you to know that if Jake or anyone else bothers you again, you call me. My number's in the phone book, or you can reach me through dispatch, day or night. Marcus nodded his thanks and continued toward the market. Sheriff Martinez seemed competent and fair-minded, the kind of law enforcement officer he'd worked with overseas, professional, observant, and not easily impressed by local politics or personalities. Henderson's Market was a throwback to an earlier era, with narrow aisles and creaky wooden floors that announced every customer's arrival. The owner, Bill Henderson, was a man in his 60s who'd inherited the store from his father and seemed to know every product's location by heart. "Morning," Bill said as Marcus entered. "You're the new fellow renting from Eleanor Patterson, right?" "That's right, Marcus Chen. Bill Henderson, welcome to Millbrook." He gestured around the store. "Anything you can't find, just holler." We don't have the selection of those big chain stores, but we make up for it in service. Marcus gathered the basics: coffee, bread, milk, eggs, and some fresh vegetables. As he moved through the aisles, he became aware of other shoppers giving him sideways glances. Word had indeed travelled fast about the incident at Murphy's, and he could see the speculation in their eyes. At the checkout counter, Bill rang up his purchases with practiced efficiency. "Settling in okay? I know it can. Be tough adjusting to small-town life if you're used to the city." "It's been peaceful," Marcus said, "which is what I was looking for." "Well, you came to the right place. We don't get much excitement around here except during football season." Bill handed him his change. "You seem like a quiet sort. I respect that. Not everyone needs to broadcast their life story to feel important." The comment seemed pointed, and Marcus wondered if it was Bill's way of indicating he'd heard about Jake's assumptions and didn't share them. Walking back to his apartment, Marcus took a different route that led him past Morrison Construction's yard. Through the chain-link fence, he could see Jake directing a crew loading materials onto a flatbed truck. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Jake's expression hardened into the same hostility from the night before. Marcus continued, walking without changing pace or expression. He'd dealt with hostile locals before, in places where the stakes were considerably higher than small-town gossip. Jake Morrison was a minor annoyance, nothing more. But that afternoon, the annoyance escalated. Marcus was coming back from his daily walk when he found his car surrounded by 3 young men. Jake stood leaning against the driver's door, while Tyler and Chad flanked the vehicle like sentries. All 3 wore Morrison Construction t-shirts and expressions of barely controlled aggression. "Afternoon, war hero," Jake said as Marcus approached. "Nice ride. Bet it's got all the latest features." Marcus's Honda Civic was 15 years old and showed every mile, but he kept it clean and maintained. "Is there something you need?" "Just wondering if you've got all your paperwork in order. Registration, insurance, inspection stickers." "Sheriff, Martinez is pretty strict about that stuff, especially with out-of-town drivers." Tyler walked slowly around the car, making a show of examining every detail. "This inspection sticker looks a little faded. It's hard to read the date." "It's current," Marcus said evenly. "I'm sure it is," Jake replied. "But you know how it is with older vehicles. Sometimes things get overlooked. Sometimes there are safety issues." Chad had moved to the rear of the car and was crouched down near the back tire. "Tread looks pretty worn on this one. Might not pass a safety inspection." The threat was subtle but clear. Jake and his crew had access to official-looking uniforms and enough local connections to make Marcus's life difficult if they chose to. A word to the right person about safety concerns could result in unexpected visits from code enforcement and fire inspectors or any number of bureaucratic obstacles. "I maintain my vehicle properly," Marcus said. "Oh, I'm sure you will try," Jake said, "but sometimes these old cars develop problems without warning. Tire pressure drops, brake lines get corroded, electrical systems fail. Dangerous stuff, especially for someone who might not notice the warning signs." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The veiled threats were escalating from personal harassment to potential property damage, or worse. In his previous life, this would have been the point where he took decisive action to neutralize the threat. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Iraq. This was small-town Pennsylvania, where the rules were different and the consequences of overreaction could follow him for years. You're done here?" Marcus asked. Jake straightened up from the car door. "We're done when I say we're done. See, this is our town. We grew up here, we work here, we pay taxes here. That gives us certainty, privileges when it comes to deciding who fits in and who doesn't. And you've decided I don't fit in." "Bingo. Nothing personal, you understand. It's just that we like. And things a certain way around here, quiet, predictable, safe. And guys like you." Jake shook his head. Guys like you bring chaos. Maybe not intentionally, but it follows you anyway. Tyler and Chad had moved closer, creating a loose triangle around Marcus. It was a classic intimidation formation designed to make the target feel trapped and outnumbered. Marcus assessed the situation with the same analytical detachment he'd once applied to hostile territories. 3 opponents, all younger and larger than him, all carried themselves like men who'd won most of their fights through size and aggression. Rather than skill, his injured leg would slow him down, but not significantly in close quarters. The car at his back limited his movement options, but also prevented them from completely surrounding him. If this escalated to violence, he could end it quickly. But the aftermath would be problematic. Small-town justice often favored locals over outsiders, especially when the outsider was perceived as the aggressor. And explaining how a limping stranger had managed to incapacitate 3 healthy young men would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus said carefully. "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to live quietly and mind my own business." "That's what they all say," Jake replied. "But trouble has a way of finding guys like you. Bar fights, domestic disputes, problems with creditors or ex-partners. And when it does find you, it becomes our problem too. That's not going to happen." "How can you be sure? I mean, look at yourself. You're obviously running from something. Nobody moves to a place like Millbrook unless they're trying to disappear. And that limp," Jake gestured dismissively, "that tells a story all by itself. Maybe it was a car accident because you were driving drunk. Maybe it was a fight that went wrong. Maybe it was something even worse." Marcus felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd experienced in hostile territory when locals made it clear that his presence wasn't welcome. The same calculating calm that had kept him alive through numerous deployments. "You're wrong about me," he said quietly. "Am I? Then prove it. Tell us exactly why you're here and what you're running from. Full disclosure, no more mysterious stranger routine." The demand hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, the expectation that he would either comply or back down. These young men had probably used similar tactics countless times, escalating pressure until their target either submitted or did something stupid that justified whatever came next. "My personal business is none of your concern," Marcus said. Jake's smile was cold. "Wrong answer." Tyler stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Marcus. "See, that's exactly the kind of response that makes us nervous. Honest people don't have problems talking about themselves. Especially when they're asking to be part of our community," Chad added. "We have a right to know who we're dealing with." Marcus looked at each of them in turn, noting their positions, their body language, the subtle signs that indicated they were working up to something more than verbal harassment. Jake's hands were clenched into loose fists. Tyler was rocking, slightly on the balls of his feet. Chad kept glancing around to make sure they weren't being observed. "Step away from my car," Marcus said. "Or what?" Jake asked. "You'll call the sheriff?" "Go ahead. We're not doing anything illegal, just having a conversation with a neighbor about community safety." "Public street, public conversation," Tyler agreed. "Nothing wrong with concerned citizens looking out for each other." Marcus realized they'd thought this through. Whatever they were planning, they'd considered the legal angles and convinced themselves they were within bounds. It was the kind of calculated bullying that thrived in small communities where everyone knew everyone else and outsiders had no natural allies. "Last time," Marcus said, "step away from my car." Jake's grin widened. "You know what? I don't think I will. In fact, I think we might stand here for a while longer. Maybe take a closer look at this vehicle, make sure everything's in order." He reached out, as if to touch the car's hood, a gesture that was clearly meant to provoke rather than examine. But as his hand moved toward the metal surface, Marcus spoke again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Something in his tone made all 3 young men pause. It wasn't louder or more aggressive than his previous statements, but there was a quality to it that hadn't been there before, a subtle shift that suggested the conversation had moved into different territory. Jake's hand stopped inches from the car. "Why not?" Marcus met his eyes directly. "Because then this stops being a conversation and becomes something else entirely." The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they carried an unmistakable weight. For the first time since the confrontation began, Jake looked uncertain. Tyler and Chad exchanged glances, suddenly aware that the dynamic had shifted in ways they didn't understand. The limping stranger, who'd seemed so passive and vulnerable a moment before, now radiated, something that made their instincts scream warnings. "Are you threatening us?" Jake asked, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I'm explaining the consequences," Marcus replied. "You can walk away right now, and this conversation never happened. Or you can escalate and discover why I really walk with a limp." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus could see the internal debate playing out on Jake's face, pride warring with an instinct for self-preservation that was probably screaming at him to back down. Finally, Jake stepped away from the car. "This isn't over," he said, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "It is, if you want it to be," Marcus replied. The three young men walked away, but their body language promised that the conflict was far from resolved. Marcus watched them go, then got into his car and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. He'd managed to diffuse the immediate situation without violence, but he knew it was only a temporary victory. Men like Jake Morrison didn't back down gracefully, especially not in front of their friends and in their own territory. They would regroup, plan, and come back with something more than empty threats. Marcus started the engine and drove the 2 blocks to his apartment, his mind already considering options and contingencies. He'd hoped to find peace in Millbrook, but peace, it seemed, was a luxury he wasn't going to be allowed to enjoy. That evening he sat by his window and watched the town settle into its nighttime routine. Lights came on in houses where families were gathering for dinner, where children were doing homework, where couples were sharing the small intimacies of married life. It was a good town filled with good people, just as Sheriff Martinez had said. But every community had its darker elements, and Marcus had apparently stumbled into the crosshairs of Millbrook's particular brand of homegrown trouble. He thought about leaving, packing up his few belongings, and finding another small town where he could heal in anonymity, but running would solve nothing. There would always be another Jake Morrison in another small town, always another test of whether he belonged or should keep moving. Besides, something deep inside him had been awakened by the confrontation. For months, he'd been living like a ghost, going through the motions of recovery, while his real self remained buried under layers of trauma and medication. But today, for just a moment, he'd felt like himself again. It was a dangerous feeling, and he knew it. The man he'd been before his injury wasn't suited for civilian life, wasn't built for small-town conflicts and neighborhood disputes. That man solved problems with overwhelming force and left nothing to chance, but maybe there was a middle ground. Maybe he could find a way to defend himself and claim his place in this community without becoming someone he no longer wanted to be. Outside his window, Millbrook slept peacefully under a canopy of autumn stars. But Marcus Chen remained awake, planning for the confrontation he knew was coming. 3 days passed in deceptive calm. Marcus maintained his routine: morning coffee, walks around town, visits to Henderson's market. But now he moved with heightened awareness. His training had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of surveillance, and he could feel eyes tracking his movements throughout Millbrook. Jake Morrison and his crew weren't trying to hide their interest. They appeared at strategic locations, during Marcus's daily routine, lingering outside the market when he shopped, driving slowly past his apartment building, positioning themselves at the diner's window when he walked by. It was psychological warfare, small-town style, designed to make him feel watched, unwelcome, and isolated. But their amateur surveillance revealed more about them than it did about him. Marcus noted their patterns, their preferred positions, the times they were most active. Jake typically worked until 5, then gathered his crew for what appeared to be planning sessions at various locations around town. Tyler lived in a trailer park on the outskirts and drove a loud motorcycle that announced his arrival from blocks away. Chad still lived with his parents in a neat colonial near the high school and seemed to be the most reluctant participant. In their campaign of harassment, on Thursday morning, Marcus decided to break his routine. Instead of his usual route through downtown, he drove to the old railroad tracks that ran along Millbrook's eastern edge. The rails had been abandoned for decades, but the right-of-way remained clear, creating a natural walking trail that stretched for miles through woods and farmland. The autumn air was crisp, and his leg felt strong enough for a longer trek. He parked near the old depot, now converted to a small museum, and began walking north along the grass-covered tracks. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, he felt truly alone. The peace lasted exactly 47 minutes. Marcus heard the motorcycle engine long before he saw it. Tyler's Harley was distinctive, loud, poorly maintained, and running rich enough to leave a visible exhaust trail. The sound grew closer, echoing off the trees that lined the abandoned railway. Marcus didn't change his pace or look back. He'd chosen this route partly because it offered excellent visibility in all directions and multiple escape routes through the surrounding woods. If Jake's crew wanted to escalate their harassment campaign, they'd picked good terrain for it. The motorcycle appeared around a curve about a quarter-mile behind him. Tyler riding alone, but clearly not out for a casual tour of the countryside. He accelerated when he spotted Marcus, closing the distance with the kind of aggressive riding that suggested hostile intent. Marcus stepped off the tracks and into the tree line, putting solid cover between himself and the approaching motorcycle. Through the branches, he watched Tyler slow down and scan the area, obviously confused by his target's sudden disappearance. "Hey!" Tyler called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I know you're in there! Come out and talk like a man!" Marcus remained motionless behind a large oak tree, observing Tyler's body language and listening to the motorcycle's engine rhythm. The young man was clearly agitated, revving the engine and turning in tight circles on the narrow path. "Jake wants to have a conversation with you," Tyler continued, "about community standards and mutual respect. You can't keep hiding from us." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Tyler was demanding a conversation while his target remained hidden 20 yards away, perfectly positioned to observe and potentially neutralize the threat if necessary. These young men understood intimidation, but not tactics, aggression, but not strategy. After 5 minutes of shouting into empty woods, Tyler gave up and roared away toward town. Marcus waited another 10 minutes before emerging from cover, then completed his walk using a circuitous route that brought him back to his car from an unexpected direction. But the encounter had clarified something important. Jake Morrison was escalating. Sending Tyler to the isolated railway tracks suggested they were moving beyond public harassment towards something more direct and potentially dangerous. That evening, Marcus made 2 decisions. First, he would stop avoiding confrontation. Running and hiding only encouraged bullies and made them bolder. Second, he would have a conversation with Sheriff Martinez about the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. The sheriff's office occupied half of Millbrook's small municipal building, sharing space with the town clerk and the volunteer fire department's administrative offices. Marcus arrived during the quiet period between the day shift and evening patrol, when Martinez was likely to be catching up on paperwork. "Mr. Chen," she said as he entered, "I was wondering when you'd come to see me." "You were expecting me?" 3. Young men on motorcycles and in pickup trucks, following a limping stranger around a town of 800 people. Nothing stays secret here for long. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. Coffee? Please. Martinez poured 2 cups from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since morning. So, talk to me. Marcus accepted the coffee and organized his thoughts. Jake Morrison and his friends have been escalating their harassment. Today, one of them followed me to the old railway tracks and demanded a conversation about community standards. Tyler Brennan. I know his bike. Martinez made a note on a pad. What exactly did he say? Marcus recounted the encounter, sticking to facts and avoiding interpretations. Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about times and locations. This is concerning, she said when he finished. Isolated, location, aggressive pursuit that crosses the line from harassment into stalking behavior. I'm not looking to press charges yet, but I wanted you to be aware of the situation in case it escalates further. Martinez studied him over her coffee cup. Can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer. Of course. What's your background? I've been a cop for 12 years and I've seen a lot of different people handle stress and conflict. You're not reacting the way most civilians would to this kind of harassment. Marcus had expected this question. Sheriff Martinez was too observant to miss the signs that set him apart from ordinary citizens. I served in the military, multiple deployments overseas. What branch? Army, Special Forces. Martinez nodded slowly. That explains a lot. How many deployments? 6. Combat? Extensive. She leaned back in her chair, processing this information. So when Jake Morrison and his crew are playing their intimidation games, they have no idea they're messing with someone who's survived actual warfare. That's correct. And you're not retaliating because... Marcus considered his answer carefully. Because I came here to recover from an injury and find some peace. Because these are American civilians in an American town, not enemy combatants. And because the person I was overseas isn't the person I want to be here. But if they push too far, I'll defend myself. But I'd prefer to resolve this without violence. Martinez stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. Jake Morrison isn't a bad kid fundamentally, but he's stuck in high school, mentally and emotionally, star quarterback who never learned that the real world doesn't care about his touchdown record. And his friends? Followers. Tyler's got anger issues, probably undiagnosed ADHD, and a chaotic home life. Chad's the most reasonable of the 3, but he's afraid of being excluded from the group. She turned back to Marcus. The problem is, Jake's convinced himself that you're some kind of threat to the community. In his mind, he's the hero protecting Millbrook from a dangerous outsider. What do you suggest? Officially, I'm going to have individual conversations with all 3 of them about harassment and stalking laws. Make it clear that their behavior is being documented and that further incidents will result in arrests. And unofficially, Martinez smiled grimly. Unofficially, I think Jake Morrison is about to learn a very important lesson about the difference between high school bullying and adult consequences. Marcus finished his coffee and stood to leave. I appreciate your help, Sheriff. Call me. Angela and Marcus, if this situation gets out of hand, I want you to call me immediately, day or night. Don't try to handle it alone. Understood. But as Marcus walked back to his apartment, he suspected that Jake Morrison wasn't going to be deterred by official warnings. Young men like Jake had to learn through experience, and experience was often a harsh teacher. That night, Marcus lay in bed listening to the sounds of Millbrook settling into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked intermittently. A car passed on the street below, its headlights briefly illuminating his ceiling. Normal sounds of a normal town where normal people lived normal lives, but normalcy was fragile, especially when it depended on everyone following unwritten rules about acceptable behavior. Jake Morrison had already broken those rules, and tomorrow would reveal whether Sheriff Martinez's intervention had any effect. Marcus dozed fitfully, his subconscious maintaining the vigilance that had kept him alive through 6 combat deployments. Part of him hoped that Jake would see reason and back down, but a deeper part, the part that had learned to trust instincts over optimism, knew that the real confrontation was still coming. Friday morning brought grey skies and the smell of impending rain. Marcus followed his usual routine but varied the timing, leaving for his morning walk 30 minutes earlier than normal. The change immediately paid dividends. As he rounded the corner onto Elm Street, he spotted Chad Hoffman sitting in a pickup truck, clearly positioned to observe his apartment building. Chad looked surprised and embarrassed to be caught in such obvious surveillance. When Marcus approached the truck, the young man actually blushed. "Morning, Chad," Marcus said pleasantly. "Oh, morning." Chad fidgeted with his coffee cup. "Just, waiting for a friend." "Anyone I know?" Chad's discomfort was palpable. Unlike Jake and Tyler, he seemed to understand that what they were doing was wrong. "Look, Mr. Chen, I want you to know that this wasn't my idea." "What wasn't your idea?" "Following you around, making you uncomfortable. I told Jake it was stupid, but he's convinced you're planning something." Marcus leaned against the truck's fender. "What kind of something?" "I don't know. He won't say exactly. But he keeps talking about how guys like you always cause trouble eventually, and how we need to be ready when it happens." "Guys like me?" Chad looked even more uncomfortable. Military guys with PTSD or whatever. He saw some documentary about veterans who come back all messed up and can't adjust to civilian life. Marcus felt a familiar flash of anger, but kept his voice level. "And he thinks I'm one of those veterans. He thinks all veterans are like that, ticking time bombs waiting to go off." Chad shook his head. "I tried to tell him my grandfather served in Vietnam and he's the most peaceful guy you'd ever meet. But Jake doesn't want to hear it. What about Tyler? Tyler just goes along with whatever Jake says. He's not really bright, and he's got his own problems at home. His dad drinks, and when his dad drinks, Tyler usually ends up with bruises." The information painted a clearer picture of the group dynamics. Jake was the leader, driven by misguided conviction and adolescent pride. Tyler was an angry follower looking for someone to take his frustrations out on, and Chad was the reluctant participant, caught between loyalty to his friends and his own moral compass. "Chad," Marcus said quietly, "I'm not a threat to this community. I came here to heal from an injury and live quietly. I have no interest in causing trouble for anyone." "I believe you, but Jake won't. He's got it in his head that you're some kind of con man or criminal, and nothing's going to change his mind until what?" Chad looked away. "Until something happens, something that proves he was right all along." The implication was chilling. Jake Morrison wasn't just harassing Marcus. He was waiting for an excuse to escalate, hoping for some incident that would justify more extreme measures. "Is that why you're here this morning? To watch for something to happen?" "Jake thinks you might try to break into houses when people are at work. He's got this whole theory about how you're casing the neighborhood for robbery targets." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity. A decorated Special Forces veteran, reduced to petty theft in the imagination of a small-town bully. "Chad, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Marcus said. "I'm not a criminal. I'm not planning to hurt anyone or steal anything. But if Jake keeps escalating this situation, someone is going to get hurt, and it won't be me." Something in Marcus's tone made Chad look up sharply. For just a moment, the young man caught a glimpse of the controlled lethality that lay beneath the limping stranger's mild exterior. "Maybe you should find better friends," Marcus added gently, "before Jake's paranoia gets you into more trouble than you can handle." He walked away, leaving Chad sitting in his truck with a lot to think about. The conversation had been enlightening, but also troubling. If Jake was actively hoping for an incident to justify his behavior, it meant he might try to create one. The Rest of the morning passed without incident, but Marcus noticed increased activity around town. More Morrison construction vehicles than usual, more workers wearing company shirts, more casual surveillance from strategic positions. Jake was mobilizing his resources for something bigger than random harassment. At noon, Marcus decided to force the issue. Instead of avoiding Jake's crew, he would seek them out and attempt one final conversation before the situation deteriorated completely. Sometimes direct confrontation was the only way to cut through layers of assumption and misunderstanding. He found them at Rosie's Pizza, a small restaurant near the town center that served as an unofficial gathering place for the local construction crews. Jake, Tyler, and two other men Marcus didn't recognize were seated at a corner table, their conversation stopping abruptly when he entered. Marcus walked directly to their table, ignoring the sudden tension that filled the restaurant. "Jake, we need to talk." Jake leaned back in his chair, a smug expression spreading across his face. Well, look who decided to come out of hiding." 5 minutes. Outside. Just the two of us. "I don't think so. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my friends." Marcus glanced around the restaurant. A dozen other patrons were trying to pretend they weren't listening, but every conversation had stopped. This wasn't the place for a frank discussion about harassment and escalation. "Your choice," Marcus said. "But this is your last chance to resolve this peacefully." Jake's grin widened. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. Sheriff Martinez has already documented your harassment campaign. If this continues, people are going to get arrested. And if it escalates to violence, people are going to get hurt. The only person who's going to get hurt is you if you don't pack up and leave town." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Marcus could feel the weight of a dozen stares, could sense the collective held breath of people waiting to see what would happen next. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said quietly. "This is my home now, and I have every right to be here." Jake stood up slowly, his two companions following suit. "We'll see about that." Marcus turned and walked out of the restaurant, knowing that he'd just drawn a line in the sand that neither side could cross without consequences. Behind him, he could hear Jake's voice beginning to hold court, no doubt spinning the encounter as further proof of his theories about dangerous outsiders. The real confrontation was coming now, probably within hours. Marcus could feel it building, like a storm front, inevitable and potentially devastating. He walked back to his apartment and began to prepare for what was coming, drawing on skills he'd hoped never to use again in civilian life. Because sometimes peace could only be achieved through the controlled application of overwhelming force, and Marcus Chen was very, very good at applying force. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Marcus had been expecting it for hours, sitting by his window, in the darkness, watching the street below for signs of movement. When his phone finally rang, he answered before the second ring. "Mr. Chen, this is Sheriff Martinez. I need you to come down to the station right away." "What's happened?" "There's been an incident. Jake Morrison and his crew are claiming you assaulted them at the old Morrison construction yard. I need to hear your side before this gets out of hand." Marcus was already reaching for his jacket. "I'll be right there." The police station was blazing with lights when he arrived. Through the windows he could see several people in the waiting area, including what looked like Jake Morrison with a bandage on his forehead. Two other figures sat nearby, Tyler and Chad, both looking considerably worse for wear. Sheriff Martinez met him at the door. "Before we go in there, I need to ask you directly. Did you go to the Morrison construction yard tonight?" "No." "Have you had any contact with Jake, Tyler, or Chad since your conversation at the pizza restaurant this afternoon?" "None." Martinez studied his face in the harsh fluorescent light. "They're claiming you showed up at their work site around 9:30, attacked them without provocation, and then disappeared into the woods behind the yard." "Where was I supposed to be at 9:30? "That's what I'm asking you." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. I ordered takeout from Wong's Garden at 8:45. The delivery driver brought it to my apartment at 9:15. His name was David Kim, and I gave him a $20 tip because he had to climb 2 flights of stairs with a bad knee. Martinez made notes. What did you do after that? Ate dinner, watched the news, and sat by my window reading. Mrs. Patterson was working late in the store below. I could hear her moving around until about 10:30. Any other witnesses? The couple in the apartment across the street had their television on, blue flickering light from their living room window all evening, and there was a red pickup truck parked outside Henderson's Market that wasn't there during the day. Someone was working late there too. Martinez nodded approvingly. Good details, the kind that can be verified. She opened the station door. Let's go hear what they have to say. The waiting area smelled like antiseptic and fear. Jake Morrison sat slumped in a plastic chair, his face a mask of confusion and barely controlled rage. A butterfly bandage covered a cut on his forehead, and his left eye was beginning to swell. Tyler looked even worse. His nose was clearly broken, and he held his right arm close to his body, as if protecting injured ribs. Chad appeared to be the least damaged physically, but his hands shook as he filled out a witness statement form. "Well," Jake demanded as soon as he saw Marcus, "are you going to arrest him or not?" "Mr. Morrison," Martinez said evenly, "I want you to tell me exactly what happened tonight. Start from the beginning." Jake straightened up, wincing at the movement. "We were at the yard, working late on inventory for tomorrow's job. Around 9:30, this psycho shows up out of nowhere and just starts attacking us. Why were you working at the yard so late? We had a big job starting early tomorrow. I needed to make sure all the materials were loaded and ready." Martinez made notes. "Who was present?" "Me, Tyler, and Chad. We were just minding our own business when this maniac came out of the shadows like some kind of ninja." "Describe the attack." Jake's account was vivid but inconsistent. According to him, Marcus had materialized silently in the yard, moving with impossible speed despite his limp. The assault had been brief but devastating, a series of precise strikes that left all 3 men injured before the attacker melted back into the darkness. "He knew exactly where to hit us," Tyler added, his voice distorted by his broken nose, "like he'd done this before. Professional stuff." Chad's statement was more hesitant. "It happened so fast. One minute we were loading supplies, and the next minute we were all on the ground." Martinez turned to Marcus. "What's your response to these allegations?" "They're lying. That's a serious accusation. So is assault. Sheriff, these men have been harassing me for days. This afternoon, I made it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. Now, conveniently, they show up claiming I attacked them at their own worksite." "You're saying they staged this?" Marcus looked directly at Jake. "I'm saying they picked a fight with someone they thought would be an easy target, and it didn't go the way they expected." Jake shot to his feet, his face flushing with anger. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you a bully who bit off more than he could chew." "That's enough," Martinez intervened. "Mr. Morrison, sit down. Mr. Chen, I need you to come with me." She led him to a small interview room where they could speak privately. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. "Off the record," Martinez said, closing the door, "their story doesn't add up. Too many inconsistencies, too much drama. But someone definitely beat the hell out of those 3 young men tonight." "Any physical evidence at the scene?" "My deputy is processing it now, but the preliminary examination shows signs of a struggle, disturbed gravel, some blood spots, a broken pallet that looks like someone was thrown into it." Marcus nodded. "What's your theory?" "My theory is that Jake Morrison finally picked a fight with the wrong person. Maybe not you specifically, but someone with the skills to handle 3 amateur bullies without breaking a sweat. Any idea who that might be?" Martinez smiled grimly. Small towns are full of surprises, Mr. Chen. You'd be amazed how many people have skills that don't show up on their resumes. So, what happens now? Now I verify your alibi, which I suspect will check out perfectly. Then I have some serious conversations with our 3 victims about the difference between being assaulted and being taught a lesson. There was a knock on the door. Deputy Rodriguez entered with a manila folder. "Sheriff?" The delivery driver confirms Mr. Chen's story. David Kim from Wong's Garden says he delivered food to the Patterson building at 9:15, climbed 2 flights of stairs, and was given a $20 tip by a man matching Mr. Chen's description. Also, Mrs. Patterson confirms she was working in her store until 10:30 and could hear someone moving around in the upstairs apartment all evening. Martinez nodded. "Any surveillance footage from the Morrison yard?" That's the interesting part. They claim their security cameras malfunctioned tonight. All 4 units went offline at exactly 9:15 p.m. and came back online at 10:45. How convenient. Professional job? It looked like it to me. Someone who knew exactly how the system worked and how to disable it temporarily without leaving obvious evidence of tampering. Marcus listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Someone had indeed taught Jake Morrison and his crew a lesson, but it hadn't been him. The question was, who in Millbrook had both the skills and the motivation to intervene? "Mr. Chen," Martinez said, "you're free to go. Your alibi is solid, and frankly, the complainant's story has more holes than Swiss cheese. What about their injuries? What about them? Far as I can tell, 3 young men got into an altercation with a person or persons unknown. Could have been a robbery, could have been a case of mistaken identity, could have been karma catching. Up with them." Marcus stood to leave, then paused. "Sheriff, I want you to know that I had nothing to do with what happened tonight." "I believe you, but I also want you to know that whoever did this sent a very clear message. Jake Morrison and his friends have been put on notice that their behavior has consequences. And you're okay with that?" Martinez's expression was unreadable. "I'm okay with justice, Mr. Chen. Sometimes it comes through official channels and sometimes it comes through unofficial ones. As long as nobody died and the message was received, I'm not inclined to dig too deeply into the details." Marcus walked back to his apartment through streets that seemed somehow different than they had earlier in the evening. The oppressive weight of constant surveillance was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like normalcy. But questions nagged at him. Who had intervened on his behalf, and why? The answer came 3 days later, in the most unexpected way possible. Marcus was having coffee at Henderson's Market when Bill Henderson approached his table with a fresh pot and a knowing smile. "Heard there was some excitement at the Morrison yard Friday night," Bill said, refilling Marcus's cup. "So I've been told. Funny thing about small towns, sometimes problems have a way of solving themselves." Marcus looked up sharply. "Is that so?" Bill's smile widened. "You know, I served 3 tours in Korea back in the day, 82nd Airborne. Lost most of my hearing in my left ear when a mortar round landed too close to our position." "I didn't know that. Most people don't. I don't talk about it much. But you develop certain instincts in combat, certain ways of reading people and situations." Bill leaned closer. "Take Jake Morrison, for example. That boy's been asking for a reality check for years. Sooner or later, someone was going to give it to him." "Someone did. Indeed they did. Professional job from what I hear. Precise, efficient, no permanent damage. The kind of work that requires specialized training and considerable experience." Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place. "Bill, what did you do after you left the army?" "Oh, this and that. Spent some time with various government agencies, traveled extensively, learned a lot of useful skills." Bill's expression grew more serious. "The thing about men like Jake Morrison is that they prey on people they perceive as weak or vulnerable. They need to be shown that their perceptions aren't always accurate. And you decided to show them? I decided that a fellow veteran deserved the right to heal in peace without being harassed by overgrown children who mistake bullying for patriotism. Marcus stared at the elderly store owner, seeing him clearly for the first time. Beneath the mild exterior and shuffling gait was someone who'd spent decades in situations far more dangerous than anything Jake Morrison could imagine. How did you know about my background? Same way I knew you weren't the kind of person who'd sneak into a construction yard to beat up 3 amateurs. Your bearing, your awareness, the way you handle yourself under pressure. Take one to know one. And the security cameras. Bill shrugged. Amazing how those old systems develop glitches. Right when you need them to, almost like they have minds of their own. Marcus laughed despite himself. You've been watching out for me since I arrived. Someone had to. This is a good town with good people, but every community has its problematic elements. Sometimes those elements need guidance to find better uses for their energy. What kind of guidance? Well, I understand Jake Morrison has suddenly developed a strong interest in military history. He's been asking a lot of questions about what real soldiers actually do, what they sacrifice, and how they're treated when they come home. Very educational conversations. And Tyler? Tyler's going to start attending anger management counseling. Turns out his health insurance covers it, and he's finally ready to address some of his issues. Amazing what a little perspective can do. And Chad? Chad's the smart one. He figured out pretty quickly that he was running with the wrong crowd and made some adjustments. He's actually applied for a job at the fire department. I want to help people instead of harassing them. Marcus shook his head in amazement. You orchestrated all of this. I facilitated some overdue realizations. The boys did the rest themselves once they understood the situation more clearly. What situation? Bill's eyes grew cold for just a moment, offering a glimpse of the dangerous man he'd once been. That there are people in this world who've seen things and done things that would give them nightmares for the rest of their lives, and those people deserve respect, not harassment from small-town bullies who think they're tough because they peaked in high school. The moment passed, and Bill was once again the friendly store owner who knew everyone's name and always had time for conversation. So, he said, refilling Marcus's coffee cup again, I hear you're thinking about staying in Millbrook permanently. This feels like home now. Good. We can always use another good man in the community, especially one who understands the value of peace and knows how to protect it when necessary. Marcus raised his coffee cup in a small salute. To protect the peace, Bill clinked his own cup against it, to understand that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most harmless. Outside Henderson's Market, Millbrook continued its quiet rhythm of small-town life. But Marcus Chen now knew that beneath the surface, the community was protected by guardians who understood the true cost of peace and were willing to pay whatever price was necessary to preserve. Yet he'd found his place at last, among people who valued what he'd sacrificed and understood why healing required both time and security. And if anyone else decided to threaten that security, they would discover that Marcus Chen wasn't the only veteran in Millbrook who remembered how to fight. 2 months later, Millbrook looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. Marcus walked through the town square on a crisp December morning, his limp barely noticeable after weeks of consistent physical therapy with Dr. Sarah Bennett, a former army medic who'd opened a rehabilitation clinic on the outskirts of town. The autumn leaves had given way to the first dusting of snow, and holiday decorations adorned every storefront window. But the most significant changes weren't visible to casual observers. Jake Morrison passed him near the war memorial, nodding respectfully before hurrying toward the library. Over the past 8 weeks, Jake had undergone a transformation that surprised everyone who knew him. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. He enrolled in night classes at the community college, studying military history and international relations with an intensity that his former teachers found remarkable. "Morning, Marcus," came a voice from behind him. Marcus turned to find Chad, Hoffman approaching, wearing the crisp uniform of a volunteer firefighter. The young man had grown several inches taller in confidence since joining the fire department, where his natural mechanical aptitude and willingness to learn had quickly made him indispensable. "Chad, how's the training going?" "Great, Chief Williams. Says I'm ready for my EMT certification exam next month." Chad's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "We had a call yesterday. House fire on Maple Street. Mrs. Rodriguez's kitchen caught fire when she was making tamales for her grandson's birthday. We got there in time to save the house and all her family photos." "That's good work. It feels good. Like I'm actually helping people instead of—" Chad trailed off, his expression growing serious. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. What we did to you when you first arrived, the harassment, the threats, it was wrong. We had no right to judge you or make you feel unwelcome." Marcus studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "What changed your mind?" "A lot of things. Talking to Bill Henderson about what real service means. Learning about what you guys actually went through overseas. But mostly realizing that we were acting like the worst kind of bullies, picking on someone we thought couldn't fight back. I could have fought back. I know that now. And I'm glad you didn't. If you had—" Chad shuddered. "Let's just say, I'm grateful you're a better man than we deserved to encounter." They walked together toward Henderson's Market, where the morning coffee crowd was beginning to gather. Through the windows, Marcus could see Bill Henderson holding court at his usual table, surrounded by a mix of retirees and early shift workers who came as much for the conversation as the caffeine. "Chad," Marcus said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "That night at the construction yard, do you remember what actually happened?" Chad was quiet for a long moment. "You mean, do I remember someone who moved like a shadow and fought like a machine? Someone who put us down so fast and efficiently that we barely had time to register what was happening?" "You do remember. Every detail. The way he appeared out of nowhere, the precision of every strike, how he disabled the security system without leaving a trace." Chad glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "We all knew it wasn't you. Even Jake knew, deep down. But admitting that would have meant admitting we'd been wrong about everything. So why didn't you tell Sheriff Martinez the truth? Because whoever did it saved us from ourselves. If things had kept escalating the way they were going, someone would have gotten seriously hurt, probably us." Chad stopped walking and faced Marcus directly. "That person, whoever he was, could have killed us, easily. Instead, he gave us exactly the lesson we needed and nothing more." Marcus nodded, thinking about Bill Henderson's surgical precision in handling the situation. "What lesson was that?" "That we weren't as tough as we thought we were, that the world was full of people with experiences we couldn't even imagine, and that maybe, instead of making assumptions about strangers, we should try learning from them." They entered Henderson's Market to find the morning crowd in animated discussion about the upcoming holiday festival. Plans were being made for vendor booths, entertainment, and the traditional tree lighting ceremony that marked the official beginning of Millbrook's Christmas season. "Marcus," Bill Henderson called out. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the festival committee's request for security volunteers." Marcus poured himself coffee from the communal pot. "What kind of security?" "Nothing dramatic, just experienced people who can keep an eye on things, help with crowd control, make sure everyone has a good time safely." Bill's eyes twinkled with mischief. "The kind of job that requires good situational awareness and the ability to spot potential problems before they develop. Sounds like you have someone specific in mind." As a matter of fact, I do. The committee could use someone with your background and temperament. Plus, it would be a good way for you to meet more people in the community. Marcus considered the suggestion. Over the past 2 months, he'd gradually become more involved in Millbrook's daily life. He'd started volunteering at the library, helping with their computer systems and occasionally tutoring veterans who were working toward their GEDs. The work was satisfying in ways that surprised him, using his skills to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than eliminate. "I'll think about it," he said. "Excellent. Oh, and there's someone I'd like you to meet." Bill gestured toward a corner table where a woman in her 40s sat reading a newspaper. "Dr. Amanda Foster. She's new in town too, just opened a counseling practice that specializes in trauma recovery." Dr. Foster looked up as they approached, revealing intelligent green eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested extensive experience with human psychology. She extended her hand with a firm grip. "Dr. Foster, I'd like you to meet Marcus Chen." "Marcus, Amanda is the therapist I mentioned, the one who's been working with Tyler Brennan." "How is Tyler?" Marcus asked. "Making remarkable progress," Dr. Foster replied. "Anger management, family counseling, and some vocational training have made a world of difference. He's actually considering applying to trade school to become an electrician." "That's good news." "It is, and it's largely thanks to people like you and Mr. Henderson, who chose rehabilitation over retaliation when dealing with troubled young men." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't do anything special. You showed restraint when provocation was extreme. You chose de-escalation over confrontation, and when the situation was resolved through unofficial channels, you didn't seek additional revenge or vindication." Dr. Foster studied him thoughtfully. "Those aren't common responses, especially from someone with your background." "My background? Combat veteran, special forces, multiple deployments in high-stress environments. The statistical likelihood of someone with that profile choosing peaceful resolution over violent confrontation is remarkably low." Marcus glanced at Bill Henderson, who was listening with obvious interest. "Maybe I'm tired of violence. Or maybe you understand something that many people never learn. The true strength sometimes means choosing not to use your capabilities." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Martinez, who entered the market with her usual efficient energy. She spotted their group and headed over with a manila folder under her arm. "Perfect," she said. "I was hoping to find you all together. I have some news about our 3 young troublemakers." "Good news, I hope?" Bill asked. "The best. Jake Morrison has been accepted into the State University's military history program. Full scholarship based on his recent academic performance and a very impressive essay about the real meaning of service and sacrifice." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Scholarship?" Apparently, his high school guidance counselor was so impressed by his transformation that she reached out to her contacts at the university. They were looking for students who demonstrated significant personal growth and commitment to understanding military service. "And Tyler?" "Tyler starts at the electrical trades program next month. He'll be living in dormitories, away from his family situation, getting both technical training and continued counseling. The program has an excellent success rate for young men with his background. And Chad?" Martinez smiled. "Chad is being fast-tracked through the firefighter training program. Chief Williams says he's the most dedicated recruit they've had in years. He's also been accepted to the state's Emergency Management Academy for next summer." Dr. Foster nodded approvingly. "Remarkable transformations, all of them. It's rare to see such comprehensive behavioral changes in such a short time." "What do you think caused it?" Marcus asked. "A combination of factors," Dr. Foster replied. "Shock therapy from their encounter at the construction yard, positive role models like Mr. Henderson and Chief Williams, appropriate counseling and guidance, And perhaps most importantly, the realization that their previous worldview was fundamentally flawed. Bill Henderson chuckled. Sometimes people just need a good wake-up call. Sheriff Martinez closed her folder and looked directly at Marcus. There's something else. The town council has asked me to extend an official invitation for you to join our emergency response team. Nothing full-time, just consulting work when we need someone with specialized knowledge. What kind of specialized knowledge? Crisis management, threat assessment, tactical planning for unusual situations. Last month we had a hostage situation at the bank. Turned out to be a mentally ill man with a toy gun, but we could have used someone with your expertise to help de-escalate things. Marcus found himself considering opportunities he'd never imagined when he first arrived in Millbrook. The prospect of using his skills for community protection rather than military objectives was appealing in ways he hadn't expected. "Let me think about it," he said. "Of course, take your time. The offer's open whenever you're ready." As the group dispersed to begin their daily routines, Marcus found himself walking with Dr. Foster toward the town square. The snow had begun falling more heavily, dusting the war memorial and creating a peaceful winter scene. "Can I ask you something?" Dr. Foster said as they paused near the memorial. "Sure. What do you see when you look at this monument?" Marcus studied the granite stone with its carved names and dates. "I see young men who died far from home, fighting for ideals they probably didn't fully understand but believed in anyway. And how does that make you feel?" "Grateful and responsible." "Responsible? How?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching snowflakes settle on the memorial's surface. Responsible for making sure their sacrifice meant something, to help build the kind of community they died defending. Dr. Foster nodded. "That's a healthy perspective. Many veterans struggle with survivor guilt or feel disconnected from civilian communities. You seem to have found a way to bridge that gap. I had help. Good people who saw past the surface and gave me a chance to prove who I really was. Like Mr. Henderson. Like Mr. Henderson and Sheriff Martinez, and even Chad Hoffman in his own way." Marcus smiled. "Turns out there are a lot of good people in the world. You just have to be willing to see them. And let them see you?" "That too." They walked back toward the market where the morning coffee crowd was beginning to thin out. Through the windows, Marcus could see Bill Henderson cleaning tables and preparing for the lunch rush. The elderly veteran moved with the same efficiency he'd probably shown in more dangerous circumstances, but now his skills were applied to creating a gathering place where the community could come together. "Dr. Foster," Marcus said, "can I ask you something now?" "Of course. Do you think people can really change? I mean, fundamentally change who they are?" "I think people can change their behaviors, their perspectives, and their choices. Whether that constitutes changing who they are depends on how you define identity." She paused at her car door. "Why do you ask?" "Because 6 months ago I was someone whose primary purpose was eliminating threats. Now I'm someone whose primary purpose is protecting peace. Same skills, completely different application. And you're wondering if that makes you a different person." "I'm wondering if it makes me a better person." Dr. Foster smiled. "Marcus, I think you've been a good person all along. You just needed to find a place where that goodness could flourish instead of being buried under necessity and trauma. She drove away. Marcus stood in the falling snow, thinking about transformation and second chances. Jake Morrison was becoming a scholar instead of a bully. Tyler Brennan was learning to channel his anger into productive skills. Chad Hoffman was saving lives instead of threatening them. And Marcus Chen, the former Special Forces operator who'd come to Millbrook broken and seeking only solitude, had found something better than healing. He'd found purpose, community, and the chance to use his hard-won expertise to protect rather than destroy. 3 months later, when the spring festival brought visitors from across the county to Millbrook's town square, Marcus stood watch from a strategic position near the War Memorial. His trained eyes swept the crowd, noting potential problems before they developed and ensuring that families could enjoy their day without concern. But he also found himself simply enjoying the scene. Children laughing on carnival rides, elderly couples sharing funnel cake, teenagers awkwardly navigating first dates. Normal life in a normal town, protected by people who understood the price of peace and were willing to pay it. Jake Morrison appeared at his elbow, wearing a college sweatshirt and carrying a notebook filled with interviews he was conducting. For a research project on small-town veterans. See anything interesting? Jake asked. Marcus gestured toward the crowd. Everything's interesting when you know how to look. Mr. Henderson says you can spot trouble before it knows it's trouble. Experience teaches you what to watch for. Jake made a note in his notebook. For my paper, I'm trying to understand how combat veterans transition back to civilian life. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions? Marcus looked at the young man who'd once pushed him in a diner and made assumptions about his character. Now, Jake was genuinely seeking to understand the experiences of people he'd previously dismissed or stereotyped. Ask away, Marcus said. What's the hardest part about coming home? Marcus considered the question carefully. Learning that the skills that kept you alive overseas can also isolate you from the people you're trying to protect. Finding ways to serve your community that don't involve violence. And the best part? Marcus smiled, watching a young father lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see the parade better. Discovering that the things you fought for, family, community, freedom, peace, they're all real. They exist in places like this, protected by people who understand their value. And do you think you've found your place now? Marcus looked around. At the festival, at the families enjoying their day, at the other volunteers who worked quietly to ensure everyone's safety and happiness. He saw Bill Henderson manning the information booth, Sheriff Martinez coordinating security, Dr. Foster helping lost children find their parents, and Chad Hoffman demonstrating fire safety techniques to fascinated kids. Yes, he said. I think I have. As the sun set over Millbrook and the festival lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Marcus Chen stood watch over his community, no longer a stranger seeking refuge, but a guardian who'd found his home. The limp that had once marked him as an outsider now barely registered as he moved through crowds that knew him, trusted him, and valued the quiet strength he brought to their peaceful corner of the world. Sometimes the most dangerous people, really, were the ones who looked the most harmless, but sometimes Marcus had learned that was exactly what a community needed. Protectors who could blend seamlessly into ordinary life while remaining eternally vigilant against the forces that threatened the precious normalcy of small-town America. In Millbrook, Pennsylvania, peace was more than just the absence of conflict. It was a way of life, carefully maintained by people who understood its true worth and were prepared to defend it with whatever skills they possessed. And Marcus Chen had finally found his place among them. 1 year later, Marcus Chen stood before a mirror in his apartment, adjusting the collar of his dress uniform. The ribbons and medals caught the morning light: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge, and several others that represented moments of courage in places most people would never see. Today marked the first time he'd worn the uniform since his medical discharge, and the weight of it brought back memories both painful and proud. The occasion was Millbrook's first annual Veterans Appreciation Day, an event that had grown from a simple suggestion at a town council meeting into a full-scale celebration that would draw visitors from across 3 counties. As the guest speaker, Marcus had spent weeks preparing remarks that would honor the sacrifices of those who served while inspiring a new generation to understand the true meaning of duty. A knock at his door interrupted his preparation. He opened it to find Jake Morrison standing in the hallway, wearing a sharp suit and carrying a leather portfolio. The transformation in the young man was remarkable. Gone was the swagger and hostility, replaced by genuine confidence and intellectual curiosity. "Ready for the big day?" Jake asked, extending his hand. Marcus shook it, noting the firm grip and steady eye contact. "As ready as anyone can be for public speaking." "You'll do great. I've read your speech notes. They're exactly what people need to hear." Over the past year, Jake had become an unofficial historian for Millbrook's veteran community, conducting interviews and documenting stories that might otherwise be lost. His college thesis on small-town heroes, the hidden service, records of rural veterans, had earned statewide recognition and led to a research fellowship that would fund his graduate studies. "How's the preparation for today's ceremony?" Marcus asked as they walked downstairs together. "Perfect." Dr. Foster coordinated with the VFW to bring in veterans from World War II through Afghanistan. Tyler's crew installed the new sound system yesterday, and Chad's handling security coordination with Sheriff Martinez. They emerged onto Main Street to find Millbrook transformed. Red, white, and blue bunting adorned every building, and volunteers were setting up displays that would showcase local military history. The War Memorial had been expanded over the past months, with new plaques honoring veterans from recent conflicts, and a meditation garden where families could reflect in quiet dignity. "Jake," Marcus said, as they walked toward the town square, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "What really changed your mind about me? About veterans in general?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "It was a combination of things. That night at the construction yard, when someone showed us how outmatched we really were. Bill Henderson's stories about his service, but mostly it was watching you choose not to retaliate when you easily could have. I was trying to avoid conflict. No, you were demonstrating strength through restraint. It took me months to understand the difference." Jake stopped walking and faced Marcus directly. "That night, we could have been seriously hurt. Instead, we were taught exactly the lesson we needed to learn, with exactly the force necessary and nothing more. That's not random violence, that's precision and mercy combined." Marcus thought about Bill Henderson's careful intervention, the surgical precision with which he'd neutralized 3 young bullies while leaving them alive and unbroken. It had been a masterclass in the appropriate application of force, and that changed your perspective? It made me realize that real warriors aren't the ones who look for fights. They're the ones who end them quickly when necessary and prevent them entirely when possible. Jake's voice grew more serious. "You could have destroyed us that first night at Murphy's. Instead, you chose patience. That's what real strength looks like." They reached the town square, where volunteers were making final preparations for the day's events. A small stage had been erected near the War Memorial, with seating for several hundred people. Local businesses had set up information booths showcasing veteran-owned enterprises and support services. Marcus spotted Tyler Brennan across the square, directing a crew of electricians as they tested microphone systems and lighting. The young man had filled out over the past year, his previously angry demeanor replaced by focused professionalism. His apprenticeship at the electrical trades program had led to a job with the county's emergency services department, where his skills were making a real difference in people's lives. "Tyler!" Jake called out. "How's the equipment looking?" Tyler jogged over, his face bright with enthusiasm. "Everything's working perfectly. We've got backup power systems, wireless mics for the speakers, and even a live stream setup so people who can't attend can watch online." "Impressive," Marcus said. "Thanks. You know, a year ago, I would have been looking for ways to cause problems at an event like this. Now I'm the one making sure everything runs smoothly." Tyler's expression grew thoughtful. "Funny how perspective changes when you stop being angry all the time." "How are things at home?" Marcus asked. "Better. My dad's been sober for 8 months. Now, thanks to the intervention Dr. Foster helped us organize, we're actually talking instead of yelling at each other." Tyler grinned. Turns out family therapy works better than just hoping problems go away. A fire truck pulled up near the memorial, and Chad Hoffman emerged from the passenger seat wearing his crisp firefighter uniform. Over the past year, he'd become one of the department's most valuable members, earning commendations for his quick thinking during emergency calls and his natural ability to calm people in crisis situations. "Morning, everyone," Chad said, joining their group. "Final security sweep is complete. Sheriff Martinez has plainclothes officers positioned around the perimeter, and we've got emergency medical personnel standing by." "Any concerns?" Marcus asked. "None. This is going to be a good day." Chad's smile was genuine. "You know, when we first met, I never imagined I'd be working security to protect an event honoring veterans. Life has a weird sense of humor sometimes." "Or justice," Jake added quietly. Dr. Foster appeared beside them, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that came from seeing long-term therapeutic goals achieved. "Gentlemen, you're needed for the opening ceremony." In 10 minutes, as they began moving toward the stage area, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Bill Henderson approaching, wearing his own dress uniform from decades of service. The elderly veteran looked distinguished and proud, his bearing every bit as military as it had been during his active duty years. "Ready to address the troops?" Bill asked with a grin. "As ready as I'll ever be. Thank you for everything, Bill. This day wouldn't be happening without your guidance." "Nonsense. This day is happening because a community decided to honor its heroes properly. I just provided a little historical perspective and organizational support." They walked together toward the stage, where other speakers were gathering. The crowd was beginning to fill in. Families with children, elderly veterans in wheelchairs, active duty service members on leave, and civilians who simply wanted to show their appreciation. Sheriff Martinez took the microphone first, welcoming everyone and explaining the day's significance. Her remarks were brief but heartfelt, emphasizing the debt of gratitude that communities owed to those who served and the importance of supporting veterans as they transitioned back to civilian life. Next came Chief Williams from the fire department, who spoke about the connection between military service and first responders, how both required individuals willing to put others' safety before their own. His introduction of Chad Hoffman as an example of young people finding their calling in service drew enthusiastic applause. Jake Morrison followed, presenting his research on local veteran history. His presentation was scholarly but accessible, weaving together individual stories of courage and sacrifice with the broader narrative of American military service. When he introduced Marcus as the keynote speaker, the applause was sustained and respectful. Marcus approached the microphone, looking out over a sea of faces, some familiar, some new, all united in their desire to honor service and sacrifice. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from a broken soldier seeking anonymity to a community leader ready to share his story. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "A year ago, I came to Millbrook as a stranger, looking for nothing more than a quiet place to heal from wounds, both physical and emotional. What I found was something I didn't know I was searching for, a community that understood the true meaning of service." He paused, scanning the crowd and seeing faces that had become part of his daily life. Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store, Dolores from Murphy's Diner, the families he'd met through his volunteer work at the library and community center. Service, you see, doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It transforms. The skills we learned in the military, leadership, sacrifice, dedication to something larger than ourselves, these don't become obsolete in civilian life. They become the foundation for building stronger communities. Marcus gestured toward the war memorial behind him. The names on this memorial represent young men and women who gave everything for the freedoms we enjoy today. But their sacrifice would be meaningless if we didn't use those freedoms to build the kind of society they died defending. A society based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the understanding that we're all in this together. The crowd listened intently as Marcus shared stories from his own service, carefully chosen to illustrate points about courage, teamwork, and the bonds that form between people who face danger together. But he also spoke about coming home, about the challenges of translating military experience into civilian success, and about the crucial role that communities play in supporting veterans. Some of you may remember that my arrival in Millbrook wasn't entirely smooth, he said, drawing knowing chuckles from those familiar with his history. There were misunderstandings, conflicts, and moments when it seemed like I might not find my place here. He looked directly at Jake, Tyler, and Chad, who stood together near the front of the crowd. But those challenges led to something unexpected. They led to understanding. They forced all of us to look beyond surface assumptions and see the people beneath the uniforms, the jobs, the first impressions. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he reached the heart of his message. That's what Veterans Day is really about. Not just honoring those who served, but recognizing that service comes in many forms. The teacher who stays late to help struggling students, the firefighter who runs toward danger when others run away, the business owner who creates jobs and supports local families, the young person who chooses community service over personal gain. He paused again, letting his words sink. Military service teaches you that freedom isn't free. It requires constant vigilance, continuous sacrifice, and the willingness to stand up for principles, even when it's difficult or dangerous. But civilian service teaches you something equally important, that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's the presence of justice, opportunity, and hope. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Marcus could see the impact of his message in their faces. Veterans nodding in recognition, civilians gaining new understanding, young people contemplating their own potential for service. So today, as we honor those who wore the uniform, let's also commit to wearing the mantle of citizenship with equal dedication. Let's serve our communities with the same passion we once served our country. Let's build the kind of society that makes the sacrifices of our fallen heroes worthwhile. Marcus stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause that continued for several minutes. As the crowd gradually quieted, he felt a profound sense of completion, not of his service, but of his transformation from wounded warrior to community builder. The ceremony continued with music from the high school band, remarks from visiting dignitaries, and a wreath-laying ceremony at the memorial. But the emotional peak had been Marcus's speech, which seemed to crystallize everything the day was meant to represent. As the formal program concluded and people began mingling at the various information booths, Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers and fellow veterans eager to share their own stories. The conversations continued for hours, creating exactly the kind of community connection that had been the event's true purpose. Later that evening, as volunteers cleaned up from the day's events, Marcus sat on a bench near the war memorial with Bill Henderson, Jake Morrison, Tyler Brennan, and Chad Hoffman. The 5 men represented different generations and different paths to service, but they'd formed an unlikely fellowship, bound by shared understanding. "So," Bill said, breaking the comfortable silence, "what's next for the Marcus Chen Civic Improvement project?" Marcus laughed. "I was thinking about that proposal Sheriff Martinez made about joining the emergency response team full-time. The county is looking for someone to coordinate disaster preparedness training across multiple communities." "That sounds perfect," Chad said. "You'd be using your military experience to help protect civilians instead of eliminating threats. Plus," Tyler added, "you'd get to work with all the local first responder departments: fire, police, EMS, emergency management. They could all benefit from someone with your tactical background. Jake nodded enthusiastically. And it would give you a platform to expand today's message about service taking different forms. You could help other veterans find meaningful ways to contribute to their communities. It's worth considering, Marcus agreed. But right now, I'm just grateful to be here with all of you in a place where everyone gets a second chance to become who they're meant to be. Bill Henderson raised an imaginary glass. To second chances and the people wise enough to take them. To communities that see potential instead of problems, Jake added. To find your purpose in helping others, Tyler contributed. To the understanding that service never ends, it just evolves, Chad finished. Marcus looked around at these men who had started as strangers, enemies, and mentors, but had become something like family. To Millbrook, Pennsylvania, proof that small towns can produce big transformations. As they sat in the gathering dusk, with the lights of the town twinkling around them and the war memorial standing silent witness to generations of sacrifice, Marcus Chen reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd arrived in Millbrook broken and seeking only solitude. He was staying as a healed man committed to service. The limp that had once marked him as vulnerable now served as a reminder of prices paid and lessons learned. The skills that had once been weapons of war had become tools of community building, and the stranger who'd been mocked and threatened had become a respected leader whose voice carried weight in discussions about the future. Sometimes the most dangerous people really were the ones who looked the most harmless. But in Marcus's case, the danger wasn't to the community, it was to ignorance, prejudice, and the small-minded thinking that sought to divide rather than unite. In Millbrook, Pennsylvania, he'd found something worth defending again, not with bullets and explosives, but with patience, wisdom, and the quiet strength that came from understanding that true victory wasn't about defeating enemies. It was about turning them into allies. As the evening stars appeared overhead, Marcus Chen sat surrounded by friends in a town that had become home, planning for a future dedicated to service in its highest form. The boy who had left for war had returned as a man ready to build peace, one community relationship at a time. But the day's events had stirred something deeper in Marcus's mind. Memories and realizations that would shape his next chapter in ways he was only beginning to understand. 3 weeks after Veterans Day, Marcus received an unexpected phone call that would test everything he'd learned about civilian life and community service. The caller was Colonel Sarah Martinez, no relation to Sheriff Martinez from the Department of Veterans Affairs Community Outreach Division. Mr. Chen, your speech at Millbrook's Veterans Day ceremony has been circulating in military and civilian circles. We've received inquiries from 17 different communities asking if you'd be willing to help them develop similar veteran integration programs. Marcus sat in his apartment, coffee growing cold as he processed the request. I'm not sure I understand. What exactly would that involve? Consultation work? Site visits to communities struggling with veteran unemployment, substance abuse, or social integration issues. You'd assess their specific challenges and help develop targeted solutions based on what worked in Millbrook. The opportunity was both exciting and daunting. Success in one small Pennsylvania town didn't necessarily translate to solutions for diverse communities across the country. But the core principles, respect, patience, and finding meaningful ways for veterans to contribute seemed universally applicable. Could I maintain my residence in Millbrook? This community has become home. Absolutely. We're talking about monthly site visits, not relocation. You'd work with local officials to identify problems, spend time getting to know the veteran population, and help design programs that match their specific needs and capabilities. Marcus thought about Bill Henderson's careful intervention in his own situation. The elderly veteran had understood exactly what was needed, not just protection from harassment, but a path toward meaningful integration and mutual respect. Could those same principles be systematized and shared with other communities? I'd need to discuss this with some people here. When would you need an answer? Take your time. This is too important to rush. But Marcus, what you've accomplished in Millbrook, the transformation of not just your own situation, but the entire dynamic around veteran integration, that's exactly the kind of success story other communities need to see. After ending the call, Marcus walked downtown to Henderson's Market, where he found Bill arranging a display of local honey and preserves. The store had become even more of a community gathering place over the past year, with Bill hosting informal coffee hours that brought together veterans, active duty personnel on leave, and civilians interested in supporting military families. "You look like a man with something on his mind," Bill observed as Marcus approached. "The VA wants me to take my show on the road, help other communities develop veteran integration programs." Bill's eyebrows rose. "That's quite an opportunity. What's your hesitation?" "I'm not sure I'm qualified to be anyone's expert on anything. A year ago, I was the problem, not the solution." "Nonsense. You were never the problem. You were a good man in a difficult situation who needed the right kind of support." Bill set down his pricing gun and gave Marcus his full attention. "The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is whether other veterans deserve the same chance you got to find their place in a community. But what if it doesn't work? What if the problems in other places are too different, too complicated? Then you learn from the failures and try again. That's what we did in Korea when our initial tactics didn't work against Chinese forces. Adapt, improvise, overcome." Marcus spent the next several days discussing the opportunity with Sheriff Martinez, Dr. Foster, and the three young men who'd become unlikely allies. Each conversation added new perspectives and considerations. Sheriff Martinez was enthusiastic about the potential impact. Law enforcement deals with veteran-related issues constantly: domestic disputes, substance abuse, unemployment-related, crime. If your approach could prevent even a fraction of those problems, it would save lives and strengthen communities. Dr. Foster offered psychological insights about trauma recovery and social reintegration. What happened here was remarkable because it addressed multiple levels simultaneously: individual healing, community education, and systemic support structures. That's a comprehensive model worth replicating. Jake Morrison saw academic potential. You could document best practices, develop training materials, maybe even establish a research foundation to study long-term outcomes. Tyler Brennan focused on practical applications. Other communities probably have guys like us, young people who don't understand military service but could learn if someone explained it properly. Chad Hoffman emphasized the broader implications. Emergency services everywhere struggle with recruiting veterans. Your program could help solve workforce shortages while providing meaningful careers for former military personnel. The discussions continued for weeks, evolving into planning sessions for how such a program might work. Marcus found himself energized by the challenge of translating his personal experience into actionable strategies for community development. But it was a conversation with an unexpected visitor that finally convinced him to accept the VA's offer. Michael Thompson arrived in Millbrook on a gray December morning, driving a pickup truck with Michigan plates and wearing the kind of tired expression that Marcus recognized from his own arrival a year earlier. The man was perhaps 45, with graying hair and the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent years in uniform. Marcus encountered him at Murphy's Diner, sitting alone in the same corner booth where their story had begun. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. "Mind if I join you?" Marcus asked. Thompson looked up with cautious eyes. "Depends. Are you planning to lecture me about community standards and belonging?" "No. Just wondering if you're okay. You look like someone who's been driving for a long time." 3 days, from Detroit to here, with stops in places that didn't feel right. Thompson gestured around the diner. This might not feel right either, but I'm tired of looking. Marcus signaled Dolores for coffee and settled into the booth across from Thompson. What brought you to Millbrook specifically? Read about your Veterans Day event online. Saw the speech you gave about finding purpose after service. Thompson's voice was rough with exhaustion. Figured if one broken-down soldier could make it work here, maybe there was hope for another one. What's your story? Thompson's narrative was familiar yet unique. 22 years in the Army, multiple combat deployments, medical retirement after an IED explosion damaged his hearing and left him with traumatic brain injury symptoms. He'd tried living in several cities, but urban environments triggered anxiety and hypervigilance that made normal life impossible. Small towns seemed like the answer, but most places either treat veterans like heroes who can do no wrong or problems waiting to happen. I need somewhere in between, somewhere I can just be a normal person with a past that happens to include military service. Marcus found himself explaining Millbrook's approach to veteran integration, the support systems that had developed organically, and the ways the community had learned to see military experience as an asset rather than a liability. It sounds too good to be true, Thompson said. It's not perfect. It took time, patience, and some difficult conversations. But it worked because people were willing to learn and change. And you think other places could replicate that? I'm starting to think they could, with the right guidance and commitment. That evening, Marcus called Colonel Martinez and accepted the VA position. Thompson's arrival had crystallized something important. His experience in Millbrook wasn't unique because he was special, but because the community had developed systems and attitudes that could be learned and shared. 6 months later, Marcus had visited 12 communities across 7 states, each presenting different challenges and opportunities. In rural Montana, he helped establish a program connecting veterans with ranching families who needed experienced workers and reliable hands. In suburban Ohio, he facilitated partnerships between veteran job seekers and manufacturing companies, looking for employees with technical skills and strong work ethics. Not every visit was successful. In one Texas town, entrenched attitudes about both veterans and outsiders proved resistant to change. In a Florida community, economic pressures and political divisions created obstacles that couldn't be overcome during a brief consultation. But the successes outnumbered the failures, and each positive outcome validated the core principles Bill Henderson had demonstrated: patience, respect, and the understanding that everyone deserved a chance to contribute their skills to something meaningful. Michael Thompson had indeed found his place in Millbrook, working with the county's emergency management office and gradually becoming part of the community's informal veteran support network. His arrival had prompted the establishment of a formal buddy system, where established veterans helped newcomers navigate the transition to small-town life. Dr. Foster had expanded her practice to include specialized programs for veteran families, drawing clients from across the region. Her research on community-based approaches to trauma recovery was gaining national attention and contributing to changes in VA policy. Jake Morrison had completed his bachelor's degree and been accepted to graduate school with a full scholarship to study military sociology. His thesis research had evolved into a comprehensive database of successful veteran integration programs that was being used by communities nationwide. Tyler Brennan had been promoted to supervisor of the county's electrical maintenance crew and was teaching weekend classes in basic electrical work for veterans interested in trades careers. His own transformation from angry young man to respected professional had become a case study in the power of positive role models and meaningful work. Chad Hoffman had earned his paramedic certification and was training to become a fire department lieutenant. His natural leadership abilities and technical skills had made him invaluable during emergency responses, and he was being recruited by larger departments in neighboring counties. But perhaps the most significant development was the establishment of the Millbrook Institute for Community Veteran Integration, a non-profit organization headquartered in a renovated building on Main Street. Funded by grants and private donations, the Institute provided training, consultation, and research support for communities seeking to improve their approach to veteran affairs. Bill Henderson served as the Institute's chairman emeritus, while Marcus held the position of executive director. Their complementary skills, Bill's decades of experience and Marcus's fresh perspective on contemporary challenges, created a leadership team capable of bridging generational and cultural gaps. The Institute's first major conference, held on the second anniversary of Marcus's arrival in Millbrook, drew participants from 38 states and 4 foreign countries. Military officials, civilian leaders, social workers, and veterans themselves gathered to share strategies and learn from each other's experiences. Standing before an audience of 300 people in the high school gymnasium, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 2 years earlier, he'd been a broken man seeking only isolation and healing. Now he was addressing an international audience about community building and social integration. "The most important lesson we've learned," he told the conference attendees, "is that successful veteran integration isn't about changing veterans to fit communities. It's about helping communities understand how military experience can strengthen and enhance civilian life." The applause was sustained and enthusiastic, but Marcus knew the real measure of success wouldn't be found in conference rooms or policy papers. It would be found in small moments: veterans finding meaningful work, families staying together. During difficult transitions, communities discovering that diversity of experience was a source of strength rather than division. After the conference, as participants dispersed back to their home communities carrying new ideas and renewed commitment, Marcus sat once again on the bench near the war memorial. The evening was peaceful, with families walking through the town square and teenagers gathering around the old fountain that had been restored with funds raised by the Institute. Jake Morrison joined him, carrying a folder full of notes from the day's sessions. "Penny, for your thoughts? Just thinking about how far we've all come. 2 years ago, we were on opposite sides of a conflict that seemed impossible to resolve. And now we're business partners in the Veteran Integration Consulting." "Business?" Jake grinned. "Life definitely has a sense of humor." Tyler Brennan and Chad Hoffman approached from across the square, having finished their volunteer duties, helping conference participants with transportation and logistics. Both men had taken vacation time to support the event, reflecting their commitment to the cause that had transformed their own lives. The final head count was 347 registered participants, Chad reported, plus about 50 local residents who attended the public sessions. "Media coverage was excellent too," Tyler added. The conference hashtag was trending on social media, and 3 major news outlets want to do follow-up stories. Bill Henderson emerged from the Institute building, locking the doors after a long day of coordination and problem-solving. Despite his age, he'd been energized by the conference, spending hours in deep conversation with veterans and community leaders from around the world. "Well, gentlemen," Bill said as he joined their group, "I'd say today was a success by any reasonable measure." "More than a success," Marcus replied. "It was proof that individual transformation can become community transformation, and community transformation can become social movement." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, 5 men who'd started as strangers, adversaries, and mentor figures but had become collaborators in something larger than any of them had originally imagined, Marcus Chen understood that his most dangerous mission was far from over. He'd learned to fight with different weapons now, patience instead of violence, understanding instead of elimination, hope instead of tactical superiority. And the war he was fighting wasn't against enemy combatants in foreign territories, but against ignorance, prejudice, and the systemic failures that left too many veterans struggling to find their place in the communities they'd served to protect. In the end, that might be the most dangerous thing of all, a veteran who understood that the greatest battles weren't fought on foreign soil, but in the daily work of creating a society worthy of the sacrifices made to defend it. And Marcus Chen was just getting started. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.